Okay, so we are continuing with chapter 34. So we discussed in the last lecture the introduction to plant form and function. We were talking about plant cells and the various generalized structure of a plant cell. Now we're going to get a little bit more specifically into what happens when those groups of cells work together. So anytime we're talking about a tissue, we're talking about groups of cells. So plant tissues are grouped into specific tissues based on what they do and their structural features. So simple tissues consist of a single cell type, and we see this in animals, in the human body as well, when we talk about epithelial tissue and things like that. Complex tissues contain several types of cells. So when we look at plants, there's three tissue systems. So we've got the dermal, the ground, and then the vascular tissue. And these go from the most exterior, being the dermal tissue, which has the stomata and the cuticles, to the ground tissue, which we'll talk about, and then the vascular tissue system, which really deals with the movement of water and sugars. Right. So these do go in order from most superficial to most internal. So let's start with the most external, the dermal tissue system, and you may recognize that term dermal having to do with the skin. So dermal tissue is made up of several different types of cells, and therefore it is complex tissue. The first type of cell are the epidermal cells, and these are epi meaning on the outside, and dermal having to do with, again, this outer layer. So these are the outer layer of the outer layer, and this is where we find the cells that secrete the waxy cuticle. And that waxy cuticle reduces water loss and protects against pathogens for the plant. And this is also where we find stomata. And the stomata, we talked about earlier, they regulate gas exchange and water loss. So they allow for carbon dioxide to go into the plant and also can close to keep water loss at a minimum. The guard cells are the ones that actually change their shape and open and close the stoma or the stomata. So underneath of that epidermal tissue, the dermal tissue system, we've got the ground tissue system, and there's three different types of tissues that make up the ground tissue. Okay, so now we're further subdividing ground tissue into its three types: parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. Okay, these are the three types. So the first one, the parenchyma, is very simple tissue. They have thin primary cell walls, and in the parenchyma, this is the primary site of photosynthesis. So you can remember P for parenchyma, P for photosynthesis. Okay, we talked about earlier how in the roots there's kind of more specialization of these photosynthetic structures since they don't do photosynthesis. So there are parenchyma cells in the roots, but they function to store starch. So this is where the potatoes and things like that come in. All right, these cells are totipotent, meaning that they are like the stem cells of the plant, and they have the capacity to be the first cells and differentiate into all the different cells that will come out of it. So the parenchyma is the original layer in terms of the development of the plant, and we see these cells being the stem cells in the parenchyma. The collenchyma is going to be kind of a flexible structure, but thickened, and this is a tissue that provides support to the shoots. So this is kind of helping the plant to stand up strong, and you can see this really easily if you look at a cross section of a celery stalk. You can see the collenchyma in there, and you can see those collenchyma cells, and it's found just under the epidermis, and it's arranged in bundles. This tissue or this group of cells, so it functions in support. Sclerenchyma is going to function in support as well. So the cells of the sclerenchyma have a thin primary cell wall and a rigid secondary cell wall. So this is where we find lignin, and we find different fibers as well in the sclerenchyma. So much more rigid support. So where the collenchyma was flexible, the sclerenchyma is not. It is tough, it is rigid because of that lignin in addition to its cellulose cell wall. So this is where we find fibers, sclerids, and these function in support and protection for the plant. So that's where this layer comes from. Okay, so underneath of those three layers, so underneath of the ground tissue, we have the vascular tissue system. And this is where we find the conducting cells that are going to conduct water and sugar. So there's two types of tissues that we find that conduct water and sugar in the plants, the xylem and the phloem. So the xylem is going to conduct water from the roots to the shoots, and the phloem is going to do the opposite. It's going to conduct sugar, amino acid, hormones, and other substances from the roots to the shoots, and from the shoots to the roots, depending on where these things are coming from. Okay, so remember, you've got your sugars and everything that's coming in from photosynthesis up in the shoots, but then you've got your ions and nutrients and things coming in from the roots to the shoots. So phloem is going to take the non-water things, and xylem is going to take the water. So these are the two types of vessels that are in plants that move these things around. Okay, so let's look at xylem first. Xylem are your water-conducting cells, and they conduct water. And you can see these are, essentially tubes. And we talked about tracheids last chapter, and we're going to get into this some more when we look at next week how this actually works, or the next lecture, I should say. And here we've got a better look now at the tracheids with their pits in them. Okay, so the xylem of all vascular plants contain these tracheids with pits, and through these pits is where the water is going to move. Right? Angiosperms, being more complex than other plant species, have vessel elements which have these perforations in the top, and these are going to also aid in water transport. Okay, so water is going to flow up these tracheids from the roots up into the shoots. And we'll talk about how that works in the next lecture, how that actually occurs. And you can see them here in an electron micrograph picture as well, the tubes and the connections between those vessel elements, tracheids. Okay, so phloem. Phloem is going to contain structures called sieve tube elements. Excuse me, sieve tube elements. And these sieve tube elements are long, thin cells with sieve plates. So you want to recognize phloem contains the sieve tube elements, all right? And your xylem contains the tracheids. In addition to the sieve tube elements, we also find in the phloem, around it, these companion cells, and they maintain the cytoplasm and the cell membrane of the sieve tube elements. All right? These sieve tube elements do not have a nucleus, and they are connected to companion cells by plasmodesmata. So the sieve tube elements basically just do the work of moving the sugars and things like that, and the companion cells provide the nucleus and all of the sort of cell structure to those sieve tube elements. And so you can kind of see the picture here that the sieve tube element is, yes, it is a cell, but it doesn't have really all the nucleus and all of those things. Its main job is to conduct the sugars, whereas the companion cell is like the brain of it, and it's literally along the side of the sieve tube element, and it does contain organelles. Right? You can see the from another perspective here. So this is the same thing in this photo. You're just looking at it under the microscope picture, and here you can see it from the top. You can see the sieve plate, and then you can see the companion cells all around it. Again, this is a cross section. All right, so how do plants grow? So plants grow throughout their lives because of structures called meristems. So these meristems are populations of cells that are, still in their undifferentiated states. So they haven't decided yet what kind of cell they're going to be. They're going to ultimately differentiate and become the cells that they're going to be. But in the meristem, they're undifferentiated. They're stem cells. At the tip of each root of a plant, so when the roots are growing out, you've got these apical meristems, and they're responsible for the primary growth of the plant. All right, so cells and tissues derived from the apical meristem make up the primary plant body. And if you've ever done a lab, you might have done it in Bio 1, where you look at the apical meristem of an onion root tip, and you can find the cells in all the various stages of mitosis. So if we look at an apical meristem and kind of break it up, there's three distinct meristems on it that you can see. You've got the protoderm, the ground meristem, and the procambium. And now these terms, make sense. So pro means before, so these cells are going to give rise to the dermal tissue, proderm, okay, before the dermal tissue. The ground meristem gives rise to the ground tissue. That makes sense. And the procambium, pro meaning before, is going to give rise to all of the vascular tissue, the xylem, the phloem, and the cambium, which we're going to see in a second. Right. So here we're looking at left and right. In A, we're looking at apical and primary meristems in a shoot. So this is going to be how the shoots grow. And then here you're looking at the apical and the primary meristems in a root. This is probably the one that you looked at if you've done this lab before. And if you zoom in and look at these cells here in the apical meristem, these are going to be all in the various stages of mitosis. Okay, so a couple things to look at here. There's your protoderm there, which is going to give rise to all the dermal tissue. The procambium is in the middle, and that's going to give rise to the cambium, which we'll see, and then you've got the ground meristem, which is going to give rise to the ground tissue. Okay. So this is just basically the start of a plant. This is how it grows from these meristems. Protecting the cells at the apical meristem is the root cap. So that's really what we were looking at here, was the root cap. The cells produced by the meristem constantly replenish this cap, so it regularly loses cells. So if you think it's kind of like how your fingernails grow from the bottom to the top, and it kind of pushes up, and the cells here are going to be kind of pushed out from the new cells, keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, getting longer and longer, and eventually these cells will slough off as they get older and die, but not before it grows to a certain length, depending on the conditions. But the root cap also senses gravity, and it can determine the direction of growth, and this allows for the plant to grow in all different types of soil. It's kind of interesting. All right. So let's look, quickly here at how the primary root system is organized. So this is the same thing. We're just looking now at more of the major terms. So there's three zones here. The zone of cellular division, that's going to be the one where the most active cells are going through mitosis. So that's where we find the apical meristem, the protoderm, the ground meristem, and the procambium. So this is where lots of things are happening. Okay, if we kind of go back a little bit, so the root cap here, like I said, is like the fingernails. These are sloughed off. They're just there to protect the tip, right? But all the growth is happening, back here. The zone of cellular elongation, this is as these cells divide, these cells get longer, and we see an increase in the length of them. Okay. The zone of cellular maturation, this is where the differentiation takes place, and we get our cells turning into what they're going to be. So ground tissue, vascular tissue, dermal tissue, all going to happen at this stage of the game. Okay, so you have to kind of imagine this thing growing almost backwards. Okay, so that's primary growth. Secondary growth is, so this is how the plant gets longer. How the plant gets wider is secondary growth. So this increases the width of the roots in the shoot. So why would they want to get wider? Well, if there's wider space, there's more space for the xylem and the phloem to move materials, and there's more structural support. Secondary growth, we're talking about trees, produces wood and occurs in species that have a cambium in addition to their apical meristems. Okay, so let's look at the cambium. Different than an apical meristem, it makes a cylinder that runs the length of the root, the trunk, or the branch. Cells divide to increase the width of the plant. And I'm sure you've seen this before, where you have a tree and it's growing, and at every level of growth, the cambium gets wider, and you see the rings inside of the tree. You can determine the age of the tree by looking at those. There's two types of cambia in plants: vascular, located between the secondary xylem and secondary phloem, and the cork cambium, located near the outer perimeter of the root, trunk, and the branch. Okay, so we look at these. Okay, here we've got a few different things to look at. We've got the cork up here, the cork cambium, and notice the direction of growth. All right, then we've got our secondary phloem, and then we've got our secondary xylem, and then we've got our primary xylem. Okay, and then we've got our pith. So all of these things are going to be involved in the growth, the with growth of the tree. So the cork cambium, which is up here at the top, produces cork cells to the exterior of the trunk. Secondary phloem, cork cambium, and cork cells make up the bark of a tree trunk. So make sure you recognize what makes up the bark. All right, lenticels are where gas exchanges in these areas. So there is some gas exchange that happens here in the trunk. And you can see here another look at the different types of wood, heartwood and sapwood. Heartwood provides structural support. So right here, this is all just structural support, but there's no water transport here. In the sapwood, which is closer to the bark in the vascular cambium, we get water conducting and xylem tissue, right? So we're going to see water going upwards from the roots to the shoots of the tree. Okay. All right, so that will end chapter 34. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next time.